It's episode 137 of the Author Stories podcast. I'm your host, Hank Garner. Find all of the archives of the show over at hankgarner.com. And there you can subscribe to the show. It would really help if you would click the subscribe button on your phone or your computer or however you listen to the podcast. I'd like to thank some sponsors this week. If you've had a chance to check out thirdscribe.com, but maybe not lately, do yourself a favor and go check it out. Rob and the guys over at thirdscribe.com have completely revamped it and made a beautiful, beautiful platform for connecting authors and readers. If you're an author and you need some help getting your work out there to readers, ThirdScribe can help. If you're a reader and you'd like to get closer to the books and the authors that you love, ThirdScribe can help. They're building a community that's bringing readers and writers together. What could be a more beautiful thing than that? Also, Crystal at Pico's house. If you're looking for an editor, Crystal is one of the very best. She got her start as a Hugh Howey beta reader. She offers developmental editing, line editing, beta reading, proofreading, everything that you need on the editing front. Crystal can do it for you. She's edited over 50 novels and novellas, 125 short stories, including 5 Future Chronicles anthologies, and she comes recommended by some of the very best-selling authors. If you mention Author Stories when booking your services, you can receive a $75 discount on manuscripts over 60,000 words in length or $25 on short stories. Please go check out Crystal at Pico's house and tell her that you heard about it on Author Stories. Now to our great interview. Thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today I'm very excited to have a storyteller on the show who is just doing phenomenal work in the fantasy genre, and I discovered his work by his book Theft of Swords, and I reached out to him to see if he would be interested in coming on the show, and I'm so excited to have Michael J. Sullivan on the show today. Thanks for coming on, Michael.
Nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So, Michael, I begin each show with a variation of the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer?
My first memory of wanting to be a writer, well, that's actually somewhat famous now. I think my wife put it on everything I did. I was actually very young, and I found a typewriter at my friend's house. It was one of the giant old cast iron Underwoods, but this one was electric, but it was gigantic and it was all steel. And I found this and I started typing on it, and I had paper, so I put paper in it, and I literally believe that I wrote. Now I was very young; I was like 5 or 6 years old, but I believe I actually wrote the sentence, "It was a dark and stormy night."
From Snoopy.
And well, actually, it comes before that, but yeah, he made it famous too.
Right.
But I thought I was a genius, and I think I also followed it with, and then a shot rang out. And I thought, this is really fun. I want to know where this is going to go. But then we went off and did something else. And I always wanted to find that. Went back, and that was gone the next time I went over to my friend's house. And I was very disappointed. But I thought that would have been – I wanted to play with that thing. To this day, I would love to have it. Get that same machine, because it was a blast. Because it was like a doorway into a new future.
Oh, yeah. That's and there's something almost mythical about, putting your hands on that machine and trying to discover what story's living inside it or inside you, and it's drawing it out of you. There's something magical about that. I love it.
Oh yeah.
So what did you? So this kind of idea sort of haunted you that that maybe you want to be a writer. Did that kind of grow in you? Was this something that you revisited from time to time? How did you kind of nurture that spark into what it is today?
No, I never really thought of being a writer. I suffered from 2 problems. 1, I couldn't spell, and 2, I didn't understand grammar, so that really didn't work very well for me. But I just liked making up stories. And particularly when I got to the end of The Lord of the Rings, and I was disappointed that I couldn't find anything else like it. This was, back in the early to mid-'70s. There wasn't as much out there mimicking him. So I didn't have anything else I could read. And I was disappointed in that, so I ended up trying to do a sequel to that, and that was really dumb. I figured that wasn't going to go anywhere. So I started making up my own stories, and I just enjoyed doing it. So I never planned to get published. I never planned to be a writer. It wasn't until much later that I had been doing it for several years, that I wrote a book that I thought, hey, why not? This one's pretty good. I thought maybe I could get published in, and I couldn't because it was terrible. It's the kind of thing you don't know at the time, but in retrospect, you realize, oh, yeah, that wasn't going to be publishable. But what happened was my wife took over making most of the income. She became an electrical engineer, which was much better than what I was doing. I was working at a studio, which was making very little money. I was thinking of making minimum wage at the time. So I stayed home and raised the kids, and I wrote because it was more of a hobby. I really wasn't planning on doing anything with it, but I thought, hey, maybe I could. So I did try a little bit. I tried sending on some stories off to agents, but they didn't go anywhere. So I never really planned on. I'm not one of those people who wanted to live the author life because I didn't really know what that meant. I just like writing stories, and I wasn't really trying all that hard until finally I got to a point where I thought I actually might be pretty good at it, and then I really started studying it and trying to learn the craft, and that's where things kind of changed around. But prior to that, no, I never really had this great dream of I want to, go to conventions or hang out at coffee shops or be Hemingway or Fitzgerald. Those kinds of things never really affected me until I actually got published. Then I went, oh, that would be kind of nice.
Well, I have a theory, and that theory is that people are born storytellers, and then we develop the craft of writing and become authors. But I think that, and tell me your opinion about this, but I think some people are just born storytellers, that we have this natural knack. We may not have all the mechanics right for getting it down on paper and publishable, but there's something in some of us that just need to tell stories. Do you feel like you were one of those people?
Well, I think it's interesting you made it up, because I actually think that there are people who are storytellers. And those people are very creative, and they're very flighty, and they really don't want to take the time to sit down and learn how to actually write. I was one of those people. Like I said, the idea of learning how to spell, the idea of learning proper grammar, the idea of learning, all the little things you have to know for structure and that's, and language and making things, not repeating the same words and getting a larger vocabulary and all that stuff wasn't something that interested me. I just wanted to write a really cool story with really cool characters. And I think there's a lot of people who do that.
Yeah.
And I also think there's a lot of people who are not good storytellers, but who want to be writers. And those people oftentimes are the ones who learn the craft because they're much more analytical. They're much more academic oriented. And I think those people end up becoming really good at the craft, but they're not very good at telling stories. I don't know if you've ever experienced reading a book where you're just amazed at the prose. It's really beautiful, but you're bored to death.
Right.
Or it's not resonating with you for some reason. And there's other books that are written really poorly, but you're riveted because they know how to tell a story. So I think there's two different types, but I think the best authors that you'll come across are the ones who are natural-born storytellers who actually take the time and the effort to learn the craft. And the good news is if you're a storyteller, you can always learn the craft.
Right.
But if you're not a storyteller, you can learn the craft all you want, but you're only going to get so far.
Talking about those people that are not storytellers but learn the craft, my grandfather used to say about people like that. He would say, man, he talks a lot, but he never says anything.
Interesting way of putting it.
Yeah. So, I think you either have something to say or you don't. That's really interesting. I'm glad you broke it down like that because, I think we all can name a book that has a really tight plot, and you can say, and it's really well put together. But at the end of it, there's nothing of substance. It didn't resonate deeply with you. It was entertaining maybe, but that's all it ever gets to be.
A lot of them tend for me to be a lot of them in short story form, where you read a story where it begins in no particular place and ends in no particular place. There's no promise that's finished off. It's just like an exercise in writing. It may be beautifully written, but I'm like, that's great, but why did you tell me this? It's as if you're sitting at a dining room table and you're telling your family, oh, you know what happened to me today? You expect there's a point. You're not going to just say, I got up, walked to this door, and opened it. You're like, and? No, that's it. I mean, most people don't do that. It's a natural born, sensation that when you're going to tell a story, when you set off telling one, there's a point to that story. And if there isn't, if it's just an exercise in writing, then you're like, I don't get it. And then people start thinking to themselves, well, maybe I'm just not smart enough to get it. And I'm thinking, no, it's just bad writing.
Yeah, you really need a point. You talked about writing that first book, and you were too close to it at the time to understand that you needed improvement. What was the idea for that first book? What was it that pushed you to say, okay, I'm gonna write this first novel? And a lot of us do that, and most of us have lots of things we've written that we never published. But that's all part of it. But we still get this desire to tell the story in the beginning. So what was that for you?
Well, I mean, my very first books that I wrote in high school, and most of them starred my friends. But when I got out of that, I started writing more along the lines of what if books. In other words, sort of like what I kind of think that like Stephen King has a tendency to do, where he just comes up with a concept and it's like, well, what if, like a town was covered in a dome? What would happen? And mine was, what if you were given the power to do pretty much anything you wanted? And then what would happen if, you found out there was someone with the opposing force and that person is looking for you? So would you use this power to make the world better? Would you do it to make yourself better? And how would you defend against another person? And that was kind of an interesting concept that I was working on. But ultimately, I realized I actually tried reworking it again just a few years ago because I thought it was a worthy idea because there were some really good parts to it that I really liked. Unfortunately, I discovered it really was unworkable in the same way that your superhero movies have a tendency to be when they go too far. Have you ever seen the television show Heroes, where it kind of just escalated to the point where they had so many powers it became impossible to make a conflicting plot because they could automatically just change it?
Right.
So that's what I ran into. And you have characters that are so overpowered and there's no limitations on them, it really makes it hard to do certain things. And so ultimately the idea just didn't work for me. But I didn't know that when I was writing back then because I didn't really understand the construction of a novel. That was one of my first serious novels that I tried to build. It had a lot of great parts to it, but I just wasn't there yet.
Gotcha. So not having having these perfect characters or setting up situations where conflict cannot live in there. I guess that is something that comes with maturity as a writer, doesn't it? Understanding that all of our characters don't have to be perfect.
Well, there's a lot of things you have to. I mean, when you're talking about the craft of writing, it seems almost kind of simple, and oftentimes when you hear people talk, they talk about the same things. So you think, oh, yeah, I could probably master that if I got those things. But there's literally millions and millions of things that you don't think about, and most of them writers can't. I mean, successful writers really can't tell you it because it's like anything. After you to learn how to do it over literally decades, you forget all you do because a lot of it's muscle memory. You don't even know you're doing it. And I've often likened teaching writing to someone the same way I would liken to teaching someone to ride a bike. You can tell them how to do it all you want. You can explain every aspect to it. You can show videos on it. You can explain how it's going to feel. But until they get on the bike, they have no ability to ride it. They will fall down no matter how much you give them in advance. They're probably going to fall down. And that's the same thing. Until you do it and you have to keep doing it, you'll get to learn it. But I mean, I can't think of all the things, but I'm like, you got to have good motivation for your characters. You've got to have conflict right from the start. These are things that are the obvious answers. And even to this day, I mean, I'm working today. I think, oh, you know what I need to do? Like I was conceiving of a story today and I was thinking to myself, what is wrong with this? It's not the way I want it. What am I missing? And then I realized that all the main characters in the story have problems. And over the course of the novel, not one of them will achieve their objective. And I went, that's a problem.
Right.
So I realized I have to have at least someone manage to do something. And I'm like, yeah, I had a great setting. I had great motivations. I had great conflicts, but no one succeeds at anything. And I'm like, yeah, people are going to be upset with me if I do that. So, and it just didn't feel right to me. And I couldn't figure out what it was. And I'm like, oh, that's it. And sometimes I'm constantly reteaching myself how to do it all the time. And every book's different. But yeah, so it's just hard to remember all the millions of pieces and get them right.
Well, and that's one of the fun things about writing is that when a story is really kind of on fire, and it's really coming out. Of course, there are certain signposts that you need to heed. That certain things are always true. But sometimes a story just takes unusual twists and turns, and the characters come to life, of their own almost. And it's fun as a writer to get to be the first observer sometime as to how things are coming about.
Yeah, and the book I just got done writing, or not done. Actually, I wrote it a while ago. It just came out. It's a 6-book series, and it was supposed to be a trilogy, but it became longer. But I started writing under a certain premise, and this happens with every book I write. I start, I do an outline, I figure out where it's going to go and all this stuff, and then it never goes there. But in this one, I had a certain set of 3 characters. There's going to be sort of a love triangle thing going on. But as I started writing it, I created other characters, which were supposed to be supporting characters. Unfortunately, as it turned out, they were really wicked cool. They were much better than my main characters. So what I ended up doing was I ended up letting them hijack the story because I liked them so much better, and I knew they were going to make a much better series because they were far more colorful, far more fascinating. So that was an interesting, divergence from my original concept. So my first story started out in one way, and then it just completely got taken over by these other characters who were so much more interesting to spend time with. And so I'm hoping that the readers enjoyed that as well, because they were fascinating for me. You say you read Theft of Swords, yes? Okay, yes. So you remember Myron. Okay, Myron was a character that just kind of came to me, and most people who have read that character, at least the ones that have told me, thought it was a fairly original character. They hadn't read anything like that up to that point. So I'm like, yeah, I really liked it because he was a very interesting, unusual character that he didn't have to tell you too much about him, and you immediately kind of liked him because he had these interesting quirks. And that was kind of the same thing. So you make the characters, and they are really good, then you like to spend time with them. And yeah, that's always a great thing when they can just take life and they do their own thing, and then the story results from it.
Absolutely. When you were younger, were you an avid reader when you were growing up?
When I was 13 years old, I read a book called Big Red. It was a boy and his dog story. And I read that because we didn't have anything else, and we were doing a 4-hour car ride. And I read that so that I could tell people when I was 40 to 50 years old that one day long ago I actually read an entire novel. Because I hated the damn thing. I did not like reading. Reading was terrible. Reading was horrible. I never wanted to read. I didn't even have much interest in writing. It wasn't until I read The Lord of the Rings that for the first time I went, oh, this is actually kind of fun. And I actually enjoyed it then. And that's what got me into it. But no, prior to the age of, say, 13, 14, I really didn't. You couldn't pay me to read a book.
Brandon Sanderson on the show last week said the exact same thing. He said that when he was a young boy, that everybody kept handing him boy and boy meets dog books, and it was like, I hate these books. There's nothing in here that makes me happy at all. And then I think he said he was in the 8th or 9th grade, and a teacher gave him a fantasy book, and it's this dragons and wizards, and all of a sudden everything opened up for him. And he said, it's cliche, but that book literally changed my life. And I think a lot of us are like that. They try to push things on us that are age appropriate or whatever, and I think sometimes educators or family members are well-meaning, but they just don't get it, and it takes a good dragon or a wizard, to get through to us.
Yeah, my son didn't like reading either, and I got him, I think, the Rick Riordan books, and he was willing to read those. And then I bought him, I think it was an Amazon Fire or something, one of those things that they have for reading, and my book happened to be on it because I think my wife had loaded it up, and he was reading that while we were traveling. I said, "What are you reading, Beth?" He goes, "Nothing." Turned out it was my books, and now my books are the only books that he reads. So
that's so
that was
cool.
kind of nice. But yeah, it depends on how. I think a lot of books, literary books particularly, or that's a weird term because it means different things to different people. But I'm talking about
Right.
in the past, books like from the the 50s and 60s and 70s, they
Yeah.
didn't, I don't think, take into account the interest of the reader, and they're not thinking about wanting to make the reader want to read the story. Like when I pick up a book, I want a book that invites me to read it. I want a book that says,
Right.
you want to read this. Trust me, this is going to be fantastic. That's what I should get from the first paragraph. But a lot of times I'll open a book and it's like, oh, first of all, before you start reading this, we're going to sit down and I'm going to give you a history lesson. And then after that, we're going to talk politics and economics. And eventually, if you're really good, I'll let you talk about the actual characters, but not for at least 300 pages. Those things irritate me, and I don't like them. And I
Yeah.
think a lot of first-time readers who don't know what the magic can happen if you get through all that will put it down. So they like a story that immediately, like for a good example is Andy Weir's book, The Martian. I mean, I picked that up in a bookstore and it just screamed, read me. I mean, as soon as you read the first sentence, you're like, oh, that's interesting.
Right. Something different is
Yes.
going to happen here.
And the whole
Right.
thing is that way. It's just like, waving at you saying, you need to read this. You're going to love it. And that's the kind of thing that I think if you give that to a first-time reader, that's going to get them interested. But if you give him something that is A Boy and His Dog that's written really dull and stale, it's not going to capture anyone. Particularly, there's a difference between taste from, 50 years ago and taste now. I mean, you wouldn't want to give someone necessarily, Tale of Two Cities today because they would be a little bit bored by the exposition. So you want to give
Right.
them something that's going to be more modern in taste.
Right. Well, and you were talking about earlier that that you read Lord of the Rings, but then couldn't find anything to follow that up with. And I think even a lot of the kind of Tolkien knockoff fantasy from maybe the late 60s, 70s into there suffered from a lot of that sort of literary fiction mindset. Where even you've got these fantastical creatures and settings, and still nothing happens for 100 or 200 pages. And yeah, that's I think that's not just a literary thing. I think a lot of people have fallen for that to thinking that this is how it's supposed to be done.
Well, it's interesting because with Tolkien, it depends on what. Many people read that and they draw different values out of it. In other words, some people read it and think, wow, this is great because it's so long, so I'm going to write a really long series, like as if that was what made it good.
Right.
Or they'll think,
Right.
oh, wow, it had a really extensive world and it was all built up, and maybe if I write something like that, it would be great, but that's not it either. I mean, when you think about it, if you started as I did with The Hobbit, it's a children's book. It's the exact same reason
Yes.
I liked The Lord of the Rings is the exact same reason I liked Harry Potter. Because it was a
Yeah.
fun story that you could get right into. It immediately caught your attention and pulled you in the story. And the world building kind of built up as you went for the most part, except that he did have a little preamble, as most stories back then did. But I mean, I think a lot of people draw the wrong, take the wrong benefits or the wrong lessons from Tolkien, that the things that I think made his books great, people tend to overlook, and they focus on things that really didn't. And those are the things that they promoted, which is unfortunate. But yeah, that's why I have a hard time finding books that are of that type. And it really is hard to find books along those lines. Every once in a while you come across something, but most of the time, that's one of the reasons why I started writing, is I couldn't find books that I wanted to read. When I started writing the books that I'm doing now, the one that you read, that was a result of my going to bookstores and not being able to find any book that I enjoyed reading. I wanted to read what I ended up writing. And I thought to myself, is it that hard? Is that why it's not out there? Because no one can actually do this? And I wrote it because that's what I wanted. And it turned out that a lot of other people thought the same way, which is good for me.
That is good. That's the reason I've said it before. That's the reason I started this podcast is because I wanted to listen to a very particular podcast. I wanted to hear kind of what made creative people who they are. And there are lots of great podcasts out there, but there was not the one that I wanted to listen to. So I created the one I wanted to listen to. And I think as writers, we do that a lot. There's there's nothing out there that quite scratches this itch that we have. So it's our responsibility.
Well,
to
a lot
do
of
that.
times, unfortunately, people have a tendency to try and mimic what's doing well. And even if it's not what they're interested in. And a lot of times publishers or agents will push writers to try and write something that's selling. And that doesn't really work. Maybe it does, but I mean, I haven't found it to be the case. For me, I always found that if you put out what you want, that because you're a human being, other people will probably reflect your own taste. Some people will. And if you're doing what you believe in and what you really love, there'll be other people who have that same, taste, and they'll probably like it as well. And of course, then it depends on, if you have a very narrow taste that not too many people are going to reflect, well, then you're not going to make many sales. But hopefully you can hit a mainstream better.
Sure. I want to get back to your publishing story for just a minute, because I from things that I've seen and read about you, you have a really fascinating story.
You're a sadistic person, aren't you?
I am. Because, like I said, I want to peel back the layers and understand what makes those of us that are like us who we are. You wrote a handful of novels, maybe more than a handful.
13.
13. Okay, I was trying to be generous. Before getting any...
Before giving up.
Before giving up, with those novels not finding commercial success. And when you say you gave up, you literally gave up and said, I'm not doing this anymore, didn't you?
Well, yeah, I literally wrote a novel a year as if I was a professional writer because, like I said, I was staying home taking care of the kids, so I had a lot of time, and I would spend my mornings writing. Every year I would conceive, outline, and write a complete novel. And when I got to the end of it, I would put it in a drawer, in a box, it would go in the attic, and that was the end of it. So a whole year of my life of work would just go away. I mean, I would try and send it out, but it wouldn't go anywhere, and it would just be put away. And I did this for at least a decade. And at the end of that time, every one of my friends that I had graduated with had all gone on to college. They had gotten degrees. They had become professors. They had become middle managers. They become lawyers. And I was where I was when I came out of high school. And that's a pretty depressing thing when you think about it, that I had spent all this time for nothing. At least I thought it was for nothing. Later on, I discovered it wasn't. But I assumed I had wasted at least a decade of my life. And that was pretty depressing. So I said, and I just had this overwhelming sense of, I can't do this because it is just an enormous waste of my life. I've got to do something else. So I quit, started an advertising agency, did very well. I didn't even write the copy for the stuff that we were doing because I couldn't bring myself to even doing that. So I wouldn't write. I couldn't write anymore. It just became so painful. It was like PTSD of writing or something. It was just bizarre that I just couldn't write anymore. And so I gave up entirely, yeah.
So what brought you back into the fold?
Well, I mean, I'm a storyteller, or I can't get away from it. So stories would go off in my head, and I kept thinking about these two thieves that were climbing a tower, and I would wash dishes, and I would think about it, take the dog for a walk, and I would think about it. And then I was watching Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Babylon 5, and both of them had a similarity in the fact that they had stories that were they were episodes, but they also had story arcs that would go over multiple episodes, and then some would go over an entire series. And I thought, well, that was a really great thing. I thought that's going to be the future of television. That's how it's all going to be. And then reality TV came out and ruined it. But I thought...
But thank God we're seeing a resurgence of that.
I would hope so, because that was great.
Yeah.
But what I thought of was, if I were a television producer, I would want to try and do that with fantasy, because I'd never seen a good fantasy television show before. And this was, of course, before the most recent, Lord of the Rings and stuff that's all come out. But I was thinking that, it's always either been campy, or it's been, silly, or it's been overly serious to the point of being ridiculous. And I just wanted a normal television show that did like what Babylon 5 did, where you had these really complex plots that would overflow each other and would be wonderful. And I thought, I'm not a producer, but I can write books. So I thought, maybe I could do that one day. Maybe I could write a series of books, and each book would be like a season, and each chapter would be like an episode, and I could carry these long stories. And I'm like, yes, but I can't write. And then, of course, my daughter had dyslexia. She hated reading. I got her Harry Potter, and I ended up reading it and think this was actually kind of fun. Because for a long time, I've been learning how to try and write, and I've been reading very dry Pulitzer and Nobel Prize winning novels. And I lost my interest in reading. But when I read that, I went, oh, yes, this is why I liked reading. This is why I would like to write again. And so I thought I would write something that, I mean, it was for me, but I thought you would like to read it. I mean, I wasn't doing anything particularly that would be exclusive adult, but I would write to children either. But I thought it'd be something to get her to read if I wrote something, kind of directed toward her. And that's how I got back into it. So I wrote the books. And I was just having an enjoyable time doing it. And I was not going to publish them because if I had been planning on publishing them, I would not have written an entire series before submitting the first book because that's crazy. So what I did was I just wrote them all out. I was just going to put them on the internet if people wanted to read it. My friends wanted to read it. Turned out a lot of people liked it. And my wife kind of took it upon herself to try and get me published.
Wow. So it's kind of this story that while I'm pursuing this thing, it never happens, and then as soon as I give up and just let it be fun and let it be for me, then all of the pieces fall into place. That is, you don't know how many times I've heard that a variation of that same story on this podcast before. It's crazy how that happens.
Yep. Like I said, when I was trying to write for what I thought was good writing, I didn't do it. And then when I stopped and I just wrote for what I wanted to read, that's when I hit and resonated something that other readers also felt. And inside writing, it's the same thing. There was a magical thing I discovered when I first wrote the very first book, which is that if you put something of yourself into the story, I suppose Hemingway would say something true, but if you put something that is personal to you, something that you can make yourself cry when writing it, when you do that, it will be it just translates very well to another reader, and they feel the same way. You can get them to feel the same emotions you are if you're feeling those emotions when you're writing it. It's hard to do. It's even embarrassing to do because you feel that people might ridicule you or look at you weird or think, oh, wow, do you really feel that way? What's wrong with you? But when you do that, most often, people will totally respond to it in a very positive manner. And to me, that's like real magic. That's when you're not just doing illusions. You're actually putting something real into the book. And when that happens, people tend to bounce back and go, oh, I loved that. When I read that, that's when I knew I was going to read all your books. So those are kind of neat things that you can do when you find those magical things.
You've mentioned your family multiple times, and your wife it was obviously instrumental in helping you take these stories to the world. How important has your family been to your creative process and to this getting you to where you are now?
Well, obviously, if it wasn't for my wife, I wouldn't have been published. That just goes without saying. She was the one who... She's a business genius. She's the one who managed to get me my first agent. She was the one who handled most of the self-publishing when my first publisher went under. Didn't actually go under, but couldn't bring around the money to print the books up. And she's also the one that got me published through New York. So, yeah, she's been instrumental in producing and raising my career as far as a writer is concerned. Beyond that, the only other person in my family who had really anything would have been my daughter, who recently, well, she was the one who I wrote the first book for, and she wouldn't read it because she said, well, this is nice, but could I have it in book form, like bound? So she actually kind of, well, okay, honey, if I have to, I'll get published. So that was one thing, but and most recently, she's actually kind of been hired by us to kind of help out with the family business. So she's been doing a lot of behind-the-scenes work for me. So, but other than that, no, it's kind of weird because my actual my extended family, my mother and brother and sisters, I'm not even sure they know I'm published very much. We went back with my agent when I first got published through Orbit, and my agent is living in New York, but she was also from the Detroit area where I'm from. And we met at a Coney Island over Thanksgiving because we were both back in town for the holiday. And she was all excited. She goes, oh, your family must have been so excited to hear. And we're like, no. And she's like, are you kidding? But no, not my family, not my wife's family. They all looked at me like, "Oh, you're published? Okay, well, that's nice, hon. Now, what are we doing today for dinner?" It's like, I'm like, that's so odd. I would have thought for a greater reaction. But yeah, almost no one who I've known through most of my life ever had a reaction as if it was anything of any significance, except for two friends. They actually came out and they were like all excited, but they're the only ones. No, not too many other people cared. So it was. I bring this up because it's funny, because when I first published, a number of people would be on Amazon and they would say things like, the comments left would be like, well, this, obviously all these reviews, these positive reviews are left by friends and family. I'm like going, oh, if you only knew.
Right. Right. Oh, my writer friend Meg Jensen talks all the time about how like her neighbors have no idea that she's writing best-selling fantasy books, and they think she's just a stay-at-home mom, and nobody knows what's going on inside her writing office every day. It's this crazy thing that writers can live these dual lives, and the people around us don't even have a clue to what's going on.
Even I don't
it's pretty
know.
Cool, actually.
Even I don't know. I'll go to conventions and suddenly people will fawn over me. I'm like going, I'll look behind me like, what? Are you looking at me? It's like, because I live in something of a vacuum here for the most part. I don't know that. News of my success comes very slowly to me.
Well, that's good, though. That's the great thing about writers is, for the most part, we get to live pretty normal lives. You can have a very good measure of success and still be able to go to the grocery store without. Oh yeah. People mobbing you. That's pretty great. What was that first series that you wrote for your daughter, or that you wrote and gave it to your daughter that then got published? What series was that?
That was the Riyria Revelations, the one that you read.
Okay, all right. And
in case you want to know how to pronounce that, that's Riyria.
I'm so glad you did that, because I was going to murder that. But so, that's great. When you got to the end of that, and you finished it, and you realized, okay, this is going somewhere. This is okay. And maybe you got your confidence back and realized that maybe this is what I'm supposed to be doing. How did you then follow that up with your next series? And were you intentional about it, or did you kind of go back to that same brainstorming process? How did you then turn this into a career from that first idea?
Well, like I said, I had 6 books, and when I finished the 6th book, I knew I did something great. I was fist pumping around the house all by myself because I thought this was really good. And I remember telling my wife, I said, this is going to blow big, because I just felt that was fantastic. I loved it. And the weird thing is that, of course, it took many years. I forget when it was like 2008, I think, when I published the very first book. And then Orbit didn't get it to 2010, and it wasn't completely published until 2012. So it was a very long process. And of course, after writing it, I was editing for many years. So it was like 4 years when I hadn't written anything new. So that was a very long process. And by the time I got to writing something new, I had been very, very, very successful as a self-published author. I had sold like 70,000 copies as a self-published author. And so by the time I got to Orbit and then they started selling it, I knew I had a career. It wasn't like, where am I going to go from there? It was really, in my mind, a matter of what I wanted to do versus what the industry wanted me to do. And when I say industry, I'm speaking of the readers, because a lot of them wanted more Royce and Hadrian, which to me made no sense, because I had written almost 1 million words for Royce and Hadrian. I'm like, don't you want something different? And a lot of people really wanted more, including my wife, who really demanded, she wanted more of Royce and Hadrian, because she's in love with the characters, and it's kind of disturbing that way. I don't know if I should be, concerned. So she wanted something new, and a lot of people, there had been some questions raised as to how could these two people have ever gotten together, because they're so different, and there are other questions that some people over the years had asked. I'm like, well, okay. And my wife wanted me to write a short story, and I wrote a short story, and I'm not very good at writing short stories, so I ended up writing what would be the first chapter of a book. Well, it turned out it was, I picked an arbitrary time in Royce and Hadrian's life, which was like years after they met. And I actually kind of got interested in where would this story go if it was a full book. And I started writing that book. But then what happened was I realized, oh, you know what? It's really stupid for me to start with the second book. I should start with how they met. So I ended up writing both of those books, and they became the prequels to that series. And what ended up happening is now they're actually like a chronicle. There may be 10 of those books if I live long enough to write them. So I started those, but I have no promise that there'll be any more. They're all standalone novels. I don't really plan on making more. After that was completed, I wanted to do something completely different. This had nothing to do with my career. It just what I wanted to write. And so I wrote a science fiction novel that was very different, set in modern day, different language style, slightly different prose style. Just because I wanted to do it. I just enjoyed it. And I took that to my publisher. They weren't interested because they didn't think that a traditional science fiction story would sell, because nowadays it's more space opera or military fiction. It's not so much the old school, H.G. Wells kind of thing. So I couldn't do that. Instead, I kept the ebook rights and I sold the print rights to Tachyon, who got me in bookstores with it. So that was great. And that did very well, and I was very happy with that. And then the next thing was going even further back to get sort of, the Silmarillion kind of feel for this world I had created, which is what the new book is, the Age of Myth, which is the new series, which kind of covers very, very far back in time.
Awesome. So you mentioned self-publishing in there amongst all of the ways that you've used to get your work out. How has the ability to self-publish and to do so with integrity, how has that changed what you do as opposed to maybe if you would have tried to self-publish a decade earlier before you gave up writing? How has the landscape changed that has allowed you to do what you do?
Well, we started self-publishing because my first publisher, like I said, they had some financial problems and they couldn't actually print the next book in the series. So we got the rights back and we started self-publishing. But this was just before the Kindle came out. So ebooks really weren't that popular. And, we printed them up and we were going to sell them out like the back of our trunk or something, because that's the only way you could do it. But then it turned out that the day that I released the second book in the series, which is the first book we self-published, was the actual month that the Kindle hit. Oh, actually, it came out in like December, but it was out of stock for a very long time. It was right back in stock for the first time in like April, which is when I released that book. So it's perfect timing. But what that has allowed me to do is I have options. Most authors never had options up until this point. If you couldn't get published, if you couldn't get an agent, you couldn't get published through a publisher. And if you couldn't get published through a publisher, you might as well just give up. But when you can self-publish, I couldn't get my series published through traditional publishing. So I self-published it. I acquired a very large following, which then I could take those sales numbers to the publisher and say, here, do you want part of this or not? And they went, oh, yes, that's a lot of money. I would like to have some of that. Thank you. And that's the method by which you can get published through self-publishing. Now, a lot of people might say, well, why would you do that? If you're a success at self-publishing, why would you go to traditional publishing? Because you're going to make a lot less money per book sale. And the reason is that the promotional arm of the traditional publishers, as well as the release, the legitimacy, and people always say, well, why do you need to be legitimate? Well, it's not for the writer. It's not for my ego. It's for the readers. There's a lot of readers who won't read self-publishing books. They don't feel that they've been vetted. And I know for a fact that my brand went up like 300% when I traditionally published. And I can look at the numbers and see that my number of readership expands dramatically when I went with Orbit, and expanded again when I went with Del Rey. So I can see the benefits of reaching a wider audience. So I get less money per book, but I get a much larger number of sales. And as a writer, I like the idea that more people are reading me.
Yeah. Well, and the fact is that that we live in a time now where the writer has the power to make those decisions. You have books that are self-published. You have, like your new book is with Random House Del Rey. That has not been the case in the past. That, a lot of writers got shoehorned into some really bad deals and really left a bad taste in a lot of people's mouths. But the landscape has really changed, and it's a great time to be a writer.
Well, yeah, and the other benefit of that is that you have a lot more confidence because, like, if I can write whatever I want. And, I mean, in the old days, I think that people were pressured to write things they didn't necessarily want, but they knew that the publisher would buy. I don't care about that. I write what I want to write. And if my publisher doesn't want to buy it, fine, I'll take it elsewhere. If they don't want to buy it, fine, I'll self-publish it. And I have a fan base that will buy it. So I know whatever I write, I can sell as long as I write good books. And it doesn't matter if I want to change to a different genre or not. People will read it, and I can publish it. And I know how to do that. So I don't need any publishers. I can do it on my own. But I would like to have that luxury, sure. But if it's different, if it's something I want to explore or have fun with, I can do that. And all too often people, I've talked to writers and say, well, you can't do that if the publisher won't make, I don't care. I'll just self-publish it if they won't pick it up. And they're like, oh, really? I'm like, yeah. And they're like, wow, that's amazing. I'm like, yeah, it's not that difficult for me because I've had the experience. And then also when you approach your publisher for the first time, you're in a very weak position as an author. They'll say, well, yeah, but you had clout. I'm like, well, I got that by self-publishing. It's like if you're in a position where you don't need the publisher as much as they did in the past, you have a much better position to get a better deal.
Right. Very well said. Tell me a little bit about Age of Myth, book one of the Legends of the First Empire.
Okay, like I said, it's kind of like the Silmarillion, but not quite as textbooky. It starts off, basically, I went back 3,000 years in history from the existing story. So the story that you're reading, the Riyria Revelations, that's set place in a relative period. It's not in the real world, but it would be like maybe the 1200, somewhere around the area. And so if I went back 3,000 years, you're in the Bronze Age. You're in the Age of Myth, Homer, Achilles, that kind of thing. So in that time period, I actually reverted technology back to a time when humans were coming out of the Stone Age. They're into the early agricultural era. And this is the whole foundation of the human world that the other books you find out about. So this is the Age of Myth. This is the age of all the legends that you would have found in the later series. So you get to meet these legendary characters. And what I did was when I wrote the original Riyria Revelations, I told you the history of the world. And it's all crap. None of it's true. Because and this is not something I invented so that I can write a different book. This is how it was when I wrote the original books. Because I told my friend when I very first conceived this story for the Riyria Revelations, I said, this is what happens. And it's the whole story of Navran and Persephone and how this elf basically betrayed his people for the love of a woman. And my friend read that and he goes, that is the sappiest, dumbest thing I've ever heard. And I thought about it and I went, you're right. That is pretty sappy. But what hit my head was but that's probably the story that would have come down to us over the ages. The real story would have been very different. And so I knew what the real story was, but I didn't put it in the books. I kept it this very fairy tale-ish sort of history. So now I always wanted to tell the true story of how that all came about. So I went back in time to tell the original story of how it started. Now, it was supposed to be a 3-book series. And as I got to it's telling the story of this great war. But when I got to the end of the 3 books, I realized the war wasn't over yet. It was kind of just getting started. And I went, readers are not going to be happy with that. So I actually had to extend on 3 more books to finish that war. And I really didn't have so much of a plot for that section because I only planned it for the first 3. But then I came up with the stroke of what I consider to be genius, which was this, I'm not going to tell you what it is, but it was a great concept, which is going to end up basically telling you the entire history of the world in a very exciting and interesting way. So you end up I went back even further than I thought. I was going to go back to the very conception of time and space, and from there all the way forward. So you get the entire world from the very beginning, and that will bring you up to the First Empire. And then there's just one gap that's right in the middle between that series and the series that you read, Revelations. And hopefully one day I'll finish that that gap, whether it's a book or 2 books or 3 books, I don't know. But The Fall of the Empire will be the last piece. And once I get done with that, I'll have encompassed somewhere in the neighborhood of 3,000 years of history in the story.
Nice. Should I stop and read Age of Myth before I go and read the rest of the other series?
No, they're completely independent. That's one of the nice things about my stories is the fact you can really pick up any book and start reading it because they're all complete stories. I often say that I would suggest reading my books with Theft of Swords and going through the entire Riyria Revelations and then going to Chronicles, and then you can go to Age of Myth. Or you can start with Age of Myth. That doesn't really matter. They're completely different time periods, they're different characters. If you have read my existing books, you'll see Easter eggs, you'll see things that'll make you smile, you'll remember things and go, oh, that's how that happened. But you don't need to know any of that. It's not necessary to enjoy any of the books.
Gotcha. Michael, what do you think it is about fantasy that connects so deeply with readers? That these completely made up worlds, full of magic and swords and kind of all of these things that are absent from our everyday life, but when we go to escape, these are the kinds of books that we go to a lot of times. Why do you think that is?
I'm not sure, but I do know that my all-time favorite novels have all been fantasy. I'm not sure exactly why that would be necessarily, but the real world doesn't distract from it, I suppose. You can fall into this different world, and the characters maybe jump out more than they would with a more modern book where you're not getting the same sort of connections that you do to your real life. And also, I mean, a really kind of realistic modern or contemporary set novel is not going to allow you the escapism that you would get from fantasy, which takes you completely to another place. But I know I'm not exactly sure why they tend to resonate more or are better. But yeah, I understand that fantasy does have a tendency to appeal to me more. It's like so much of fantasy I don't like, and I can actually find a lot more non-fantasy books that I enjoy reading, but the ones that really have affected me the most have all been fantasy. So that's kind of weird. I don't know why that is.
I don't either, but it's I find the same things to be true, that those things that have kind of stayed with me the longest have been these fantastical books.
Well, one of the things I did when I first started writing, one of the things I tried to figure out for myself is when I wanted to write a good book, I wanted to figure out what was it that I liked about books and how could I write a good book. So what was it I liked about the books I read? And I came up with 3 things. One was a place that I wanted to go to, if I could, I would like to actually visit, or if not live there. And I wanted characters that I felt were like my friends, that I felt bad not to be around, that I cared about. And I wanted a story that was fun, somewhat exciting, and easy to follow. Those are the 3 things that were always consistent in all books that I've ever read that I enjoyed. So those were the 3 things that I wanted to find in here. And maybe that's consistent with the fantasy books that I read, and they don't usually find those kinds of things in non-fantasy novels.
Maybe so. I don't. I would love to see someone completely deconstruct that sometime and find out why. I don't know either, but thank God they do. And but Michael Sullivan, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show today. Where can people find you to follow your work and stay up to date on what's coming out from you?
Well, you can go to my website at Riyria.com. That's RIYRIA.com. I'm also on Twitter at author_Sullivan.
Excellent. Michael Sullivan, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show. I'm thoroughly enjoying your books. My Kindle is loaded up, and I'll be tweeting you as I read through them. So, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
You've been listening to the Author Stories podcast. Find all of the episodes at hankgarner.com. Thanks for listening.